Hello and good morning, everybody, and welcome to this next episode of A Cup of Coffee in the Neighborhood with Jennifer Richardson.
Good morning.
Today we wanted to kind of talk about, it's spring break, so if my kid runs downstairs, just don't mind. So it's always fun trying to work in the mortgage industry, the real estate industry, when the schools are out, because when the schools are out, it kind of seems like that's when everybody wants to look at homes.
Yep.
So it's kind of fun. You end up having to kind of do weird vacations. But we want to talk about comps and the way that a realtor kind of looks about comparables specifically to our neighborhood in general, and then how a lender looks at comparables on an appraisal. So without further ado, I'll let Jen get into how they look at things.
Yeah, for sure. So, Mark, the first question that people ask me when they're looking at a property is they say, hey, what do you think this is actually worth? We see it listed at, I'm making up numbers, but we see it listed at $650.
Mm-hmm.
Is this property actually worth $650? And that question really depends on, first of all, a property's value is dependent on what a buyer is willing to pay for it and what a seller is willing to sell it for and how they come to terms. But then when there's a loan involved, you have that appraiser that is the overall authority on this is what I appraise the value at. And then they can hash it out and determine what they want to actually sell at, right? Most of the time I've seen that properties do tend to appraise at or above contract value in today's market. That has not always been that hasn't always been the case. And
so do you think that's because they automatically think that it's going to appreciate?
No, they don't go off of what they think. So that's a great question. So what the appraiser's methodology is that they're going to look at historically closed comps that are similar in quality and condition to the property. They look at, ideally they would find things that are within the same neighborhood, but sometimes that's not always able to be accomplished. So sometimes the appraiser has to go outside of the neighborhood and pull comps. But what they like to do is stay within as close of a time frame as possible. When you start going back historically, and sometimes they have to, but when you start going back historically, you have to start, adding and adjusting those for appreciation or depreciation. Yeah, right. So, so that's what their methodology looks like. So when we're looking at properties, me and a client are looking at properties, and they say, "Hey, Jen, do you think that this property is worth, whatever the number is?" I say, seems pretty reasonable, but let me go and look. Now, if it's something that's blatantly obvious that it's probably not, we're going to have that conversation. But best practice is to always look at things, more from a high fly and mathematically, not from what I feel like, not that it smells like this, or, they use purple paint, not that there's anything wrong with that. There's a wood for every butt. But, that's how we have to look at it. So with new construction, of course, you have a couple of different variables, right? So in our neighborhood in particular, sometimes we'll see properties that may not appraise. Most of the time they do, but if you have added a lot of different upgrades into the property, we need to make sure that that conveys to the appraiser and that they're able to see that value there. Lot premiums can come into play with that. So if you have a premium lot, then I'd like to convey that to the appraiser, of course. And then, of course, when you're looking at let's say you're considering, a resale in the neighborhood, and we're starting to see those right now. We've got one that's active right now. You wouldn't necessarily look at the new construction. Typically those, and you would, but you got to adjust for that. Typically that new construction, someone has secured that pricing 9 months ago, or maybe even a year ago, right? So that price that it closes at may not be today's fair market value. So there are a lot of nuances involved in pricing. I think it's a really important conversation to have. It's almost a challenge for me that I enjoy taking on, because I'm like, all right, let's see if I can get it as close as possible. I'd like to get into that and really, do a great job on advising the client as best as possible. Of course, at the end of the day, I'm not an appraiser, but I have to let them know, this is what I think we can expect. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. I mean, it's really a complicated process from my view. I like to look at every single facet of it. I can tend to spend a little bit, maybe too much time in it. But the good news with that is that if we do have an appraisal that comes in light and the buyer needs to have that appraised value assigned, they say, hey, we don't want to bring the variance, or, the seller's not willing to come down, which is most cases these days, we have a good fight that we can put forth and say, hey, this is what we found, and we can sometimes request a reconsideration of value. I did the same thing on our property. Our property appraised 30 grand light when we purchased, and I knew that the value was there, and we presented the comps and got it pushed through, and everything was fine. At the
That's
end of the
VA
day.
though.
It was VA,
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah, reconsiderations of values are specific to
Yeah.
VA.
So-
Everybody else is like, eh.
Right, everybody else is like, it's
Yeah.
whatever, it's between y'all.
Yeah.
So what do you typically see? And
So I mean, the appraisal from us, it's a third party that ensures that there's a level of trust there, right? The appraiser obviously is a licensed guy, and he wants to do the best job that he can do. And ultimately, appraisal is looking to support the purchase price, right? Like he's looking for value in the home that supports the overall, communicated, negotiated purchase price between the seller and the buyer. They're going to look for a couple different things. They're going to look for time frame of those comparables. So how close to this closing date did that closing date occur? And then it's square footage, and it's also neighborhood, and it's also like a radius, right? So how far away from this comp is that comp, and so on and so forth. Sometimes they do have to look back a little bit in time. Generally speaking, we want them to be within 6 months. But I mean, I've seen them where they're a year out just because it's a specific house or whatever else. And then of course, if it is a unique home, that's when you really start, that's when the appraiser has his job cut out for himself. And we have to have 3 comparables for the most part.
And those unique ones are really, I mean, they can be tricky.
Oh, yeah.
I find that they're, from my perspective, they're typically like rural or maybe like a equestrian property or something that has, some type of unique feature to it,
Yeah,
right?
and a lot of things too is like they're getting into a lot of new types of construction, like the way that they're building homes now is kind of starting to change, which ultimately rightfully so. I think we do need to start getting into some of that anyways, like reusable, renewable. Now they have like even the concrete stuff. They have you name it, they're starting to build with it, which is awesome. But at the same time, like some of those you run into issues with because there are no comparables.
Right.
Because if you have the only house on the block that's made the way that your house is made, then what is it to compare to? So that's when you start running into some issues when it comes to funding the loan, because we have to have an appraisal done on it. If we don't have an appraisal done on it, then we can't do it. But yeah, that's the main thing as far as the things. Now obviously he goes in there, he takes pictures, he looks at like the quality of craftsmanship and everything else, but mainly it's heated and cooled square feet. It's the the neighborhood, like amenities somewhat factor in, but not a ton. But it's really about square foot and how comparable is this square footage to the last one that sold. So that's usually what I've seen most appraisals go, and that they go just strictly off of comparables based off of time.
For sure.
Because especially now in this type of market that we find ourselves in, I mean, it's not so much anymore, but like 2020, shoot, like 2 months difference was.
It was
money.
huge.
Yeah.
I mean, we would see like 15 to 20% appreciation month over month during that time. It was absolutely
Just nuts.
outrageous. But okay, and then a lot of buyers I find they try to not argue, but like they try to justify the value of a home by saying, well, it has like a new roof on it or whatever. And that, in my mind, and from what I've seen, the appraiser just looks at it like, does the house have a roof or not? Like they don't consider a new roof or a new HVAC system to be a value driver. They're like, it's
only can be a negative, right? So for instance, if they go and look at the roof and they say, cool, this roof is leaking, now the appraised value is subject to that roof being repaired.
Correct.
So pretty much they look at it as is, and they only go skin deep. Like an appraiser's not going to sit there and like look for things, right? Everything is at surface value, and of course everything needs to be working when the appraiser shows up as well. So that's a lot of times when people are talking about buying like a foreclosed home or whatever else. I'm like, well, hey, like for the most part, like the power has to be on, the water has to be running, like things have to be functioning, because if they're not functioning, he's just going to make it subject to all of those things functioning. So
for sure.
but yeah, I mean, I get why there needs to be an appraisal. It's always, it's nice. I've seen most of them as of lately. I mean, they're coming back at the purchase price, which just means that realtors are doing their job, right? Like y'all are actually looking at the market and coming up with a fair market value of that property. And that's what they're listing it for. I think the times of like, listing it for, $50,000 over because you're going to get it. I think those times have kind of passed.
Oh yeah.
But that's not a bad thing either, because I think, anything that's overly inflated is ultimately going to come down eventually. Now, it was great for those sellers that were able to sell their house at $100,000 more than that was probably
For
worth
sure.
at the time.
For sure.
But, for us typical folks, most people don't have that $100,000 to make up an appraisal gap. And that's essentially what happens too, is so if the appraised value does not support the purchase price, and say for instance it's $5,000 off, and there is no renegotiation, there is no lowering of the purchase price in order to meet their appraised value, then that means that the borrower is going to have to come up with that difference, and that difference is going to get added on to the cash to close. So, and you can kind of talk if you want to about appraisal gaps and everything else. I haven't seen a ton of them lately. It seems like they've kind of fallen off.
Yeah, I'm not seeing a lot of those. I am still seeing them in certain price points. It's typically the under 300 price point. They've got a ton
The
of
2 to 3,
offers. And,
the 2 to 3s.
So I am seeing them there, but at the same time, it's not every offer at this point. In 2021, I saw a lot. And variations of them as well. So I'm kind of glad to see those go away. I think that as our market is getting a little more leveled and more normal, we're starting to see that go away. Days on market are increasing, and so that's a great sign for buyers. It's a sign for sellers to price right. We're not seeing values decline still, but we are seeing days on market increase if the home is not priced appropriately. So
yeah, which makes sense.
Yeah,
right. Like if I'm on the try to charge $10,000 extra for my car, it's probably going to not sell. So
exactly.
Which I hope that y'all kind of got some information about how, a realtor kind of looks at an appraisal, how a lender looks at an appraisal. And, like the interesting fact that you kind of brought up is there is actually homes in the neighborhood that are actually resales now.
There are, yep. So we've seen a couple turnover and sell. We've got one that's currently active on the market. It's your floor plan. So great floor plan, I guess. And that one is available for sale if you know anybody looking to move into the neighborhood. Spread the word. And then we've got a few new construction options still available. Those are drastically being scooped up. So I think there are like 4 or 5 that are available in the neighborhood, and then we may not see anything for a while. So I'd recommend if you got somebody looking to be a neighbor, come on.
Come on over. It's a good neighborhood.
It is.
We'll be happy to have you.
Yep.
All right, guys. Well, until next week, I hope you all have a good one. And if it's y'all spring break with your kids, enjoy, and we'll see y'all next week.